Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Hikula, and this is one in a series of presentations based on my book, The Economics of Planning. This particular presentation is based primarily on Chapter 2, which is the economics of land use zoning. So there'll be several items that we cover in this presentation, beginning by presenting land use zoning from an economic perspective, contrasting market and marginal benefit curves. We will then present a diagrammatic representation of land use zoning and use that then to depict total benefits of alternative land use allocations. And in particular, we will compare zoning allocations with market allocations in terms of their contributions to total benefit. We will then introduce externalities as an example of market failure and revisit that same analysis, comparing again optimum and equilibrium outcomes. And finally, we will contrast price-based policy interventions with quantity-based policy interventions. So let's get started. Pretty much any city, feature of any city is the designation of particular zones, particular areas that, and an indication of which land uses are allowed or permitted within those designated areas, be they residential, commercial, industrial, open space, etc. Now, from our sort of analytical framework, from our economic perspective, what we're going to do is really kind of simplify this to a great extent in order to allow us to really bring out some fundamental principles. And we begin by representing the entire area of a city, of an urban area, as a finite quantity. And while we normally encounter many different kinds of zoning, as I said, residential, commercial, industrial, open space, etc., for this analysis, for this example, we will work with two designations, residential and non-residential. The main principles that we're going to derive from this analysis can also be derived in a more sort of complex or realistic setting with multiple land use categories, but the principles that emerge are robust. So let's keep it simple. Apply our economic reasoning. What we're going to do is think about the marginal benefits associated with residential use and of non-residential use. Now, this is the idea of marginal benefit. The concept of marginal benefit is something that we introduced in the presentation on Chapter 1, Thinking Tools. And so if you've missed that, and if you're not familiar with marginal benefit curves and their relationship to total benefit, you may want to go back and revisit that or to look at that. So as we depicted in that prior presentation, a typical case of marginal benefit curve shows diminishing marginal benefits. So if we're thinking about residential land use, as we move on this axis from left to right, what we're looking at is increasing the proportion of land that is zoned residential versus non-residential, because we're assuming that the total urban area is fixed, then if you're having more of residential use, that comes at the expense of non-residential use. So either way, it adds up to the total. So that's a very convenient way then of representing that allocation. It's the further we are to the right, the more, the greater the proportion of urban land that's dedicated to residential use. Likewise, the further we are to the left, that's for favoring then non-residential uses. And so any allocation, for example, the allocation Z, represents then a specific ratio of residential to non-residential land. So at this allocation Z, we can see by making reference to the marginal benefit curve for residential land that the marginal benefit for residential land at the allocation Z is given by this quantity, this price here, this value, which is marginal benefit R for residential. Now, because of the nice symmetry of this graph, we can think about the exact same analysis with a diminishing marginal benefit of non-residential land as we have more and more non-residential land. It's simply flipping this around and sort of looking at it from the other side, as it were. So there's a kind of symmetry in the logic. That does not mean that these marginal benefit curves themselves are mirror images of one another, because the factors that contribute to marginal benefit of residential land use or non-residential land use are quite independent. And so either of these curves might be located higher or lower than the others, even after adjusting for the symmetry. So in this particular example, this particular depiction, if we look at the marginal benefit from non-residential use, we see that it's higher than the marginal benefit from residential use. And that has a significant implication, because if we look here now at the total benefit associated with this allocation Z, we see that the total benefit from residential use is given by the area of this polygon. And again, referring to the prior lecture presentation on thinking tools, just to remind you that the way to recover a total benefit from a marginal benefit curve is simply to integrate the area beneath that marginal benefit curve. And that's true for the residential, marginal benefit from residential use and from non-residential use. And so at the allocation Z, it's these two shaded areas together, the light red and the light blue, give the total benefit. The light red being total benefit from residential use, the light blue, the total benefit from non-residential use. And notice again, these are derived from those marginal benefit curves. Now, you probably observe that there is this missing triangle here, and that actually represents dead weight loss associated with the allocation Z that we've designated. That because as we saw earlier, the marginal benefit at Z, the marginal benefit from non-residential use exceeds the marginal benefit from residential use. And therefore, by converting, and that's true anywhere between Z and the point of this intersection, the point that corresponds to this intersection. And so this purple area, which is representing the dead weight loss, indicates a kind of an opportunity cost associated with this allocation Z. This represents additional total net benefit that could be derived if we were to allocate more non-residential use and hence less residential use, and essentially to move that allocation Z to the left in the manner indicated here. So this is an interesting and important result. What it tells us is that in general, the zoning allocation, for the zoning allocation, we as planners, as we designate these areas, we're only going to maximize total benefit if we happen to hit the right spot here, if we happen to figure out somehow what allocation will lead us to this point of intersection of these two marginal benefit curves. And that's not clear how we might do that. So in the general case, the zoning allocation Z will not be optimal in the sense that's depicted here. But there's more to the story. Let's start with comparing zoning allocation with a market allocation. Now, again, starting our analysis at this allocation Z, if we think of these marginal benefit curves as market demand curves, then the marginal benefits of residential and of non-residential use then correspond to prices, market prices. Now, this is worth a bit of discussion here to think about what is the distinction between a marginal benefit curve and a market demand curve. Now, in these diagrams I've depicted, these are exactly the same curves. When I constructed these diagrams, I've simply copied and pasted. So these are the exact same curves as represented here. But the underlying question is, what is the difference in interpretation? Are they the same? Are they the same here? Are they always the same? The answer is they are the same here, but they're not always the same. And this pertains to this issue of market failure, as we'll see. But when markets are well behaved, when markets are not failing, then these market demand curves coincide with marginal benefit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that a demand curve sort of typically starts with price and then tells you the corresponding quantity. So for example, if the market price for residential land is given by $R here, then the quantity demanded, so the market demand tells us how much is demanded, will be this allocation Z. Likewise, if the price is $N is depicted here, the market demand for non-residential land will also coincide at Z. So if we interpret these market demand curves, or if we sort of access the market demand curves starting with the quantity side, we're really look at the inverse market demand. The inverse demand curve essentially is saying you start with the quantity and we'll tell you what the corresponding price is. Think of it as the market clearing price. So if we have this much residential land, then the price, $R, is the price that will just exhaust the market, clear the market, right? So there will be no excess supply or demand for residential land at the allocation Z if the market price is $R. And likewise for non-residential land. So it's in that sense, the marginal benefit curve actually coincides with the inverse demand curve. Now, the question of inverse demand is really just a question of whether we start by thinking about quantity and then go and ask, well, what is the corresponding price? The demand curve, we start with the price and then think about, well, what is the corresponding quantity? But the curve is depicted the same either way. So in that sense, we can talk about the marginal demand curve, the marginal benefit curve, and the market demand curve as being the same. Now, because of this price differential, what's going to happen? Well, we can see that the price of non-residential land exceeds the price of residential land. Now, if markets are allowed to adjust, what's going to happen is that we're going to get a movement thus as people who are looking for non-residential land are going to outbid people looking for residential land in the market. And so this is where this term highest and best use comes into play. The idea is that there's an indication that the value of land in non-residential use on the margin exceeds that of residential land on the margin. So the marginal benefits favor non-residential use at this allocation, and that continues to be true so long as the allocation is to the right, in this particular example, of this allocation M, which is in fact the market equilibrium. And I think it's fairly intuitive to see how the market will move us to that point. So that's an interesting point as well. This is worth stopping to sort of to reconsider and reflect upon. It's what we've learned is that in general, the zoning allocation will not be the allocation that maximizes total net benefit, but the market allocation will lead us to that point. That's a very significant finding. The market equilibrium in this example, as depicted here, the market equilibrium brings us to the optimum, where we're defining optimum as that allocation that maximizes total benefits. That's a significant finding, and it's a very encouraging finding to the extent that it's applicable, because it says that where it's applicable, and again, we're going to talk about market failure immediately following this, where it's applicable, where markets are not failing or where market failures are relatively small, it says that markets can be a great tool for planners, because markets can help us achieve the land use allocations that generate the optimum allocation and that generate the highest total net benefits from all possible allocations. So that's very significant. But what about externalities? Now, really, we're thinking about what about market failure? Market failure is really arises when the market demand curve does not reflect underlying the true social costs or benefits. And so if we're thinking of marginal benefits in terms of societal benefits, there may be a wedge or a gap between the market demand curve and the true underlying marginal benefits to society. And the same goes for market supply curves and marginal costs. So this externalities are a key example, a very common example, but as we'll see, there are others, and externalities come in many forms. The idea of sort of noxious land uses is a kind of natural and intuitive one to consider that creates this wedge. And so in this example here, I'm showing that the market demand curve in this example overstates the net benefits associated with non-residential land uses. That yes, there may be people in the market who are prepared to pay in accordance with the market demand curve, or the inverse market demand curve, for additional land. And so in that sense, it reflects benefit to that person who's purchasing. It's a kind of private view of what those benefits are on the margin, but without taking account of these externalities. And in fact, the name externalities is designed specifically to reflect the fact that there may be costs and benefits that are external to these market signals, and hence are sort of lost. And so the markets are signaling to us about allocate more to residential or more to non-residential uses. But if those signals themselves are faulty, then we have to question the prior analysis. And indeed, we see here that now when we do the same kind of analysis, thinking about how to represent total benefits from residential and from non-residential use, we see in this case, it's the market allocation that results in a deadweight loss. That the market in this example is going to lead us to an equilibrium that essentially gives us too much non-residential land. And so this deadweight loss, this triangle of inefficiency, appears in a different place. And we can compare those two examples here. So again, in the first example where there was no externalities, the zoning allocation failed to take advantage or help us realize these net benefits that could be achieved by having more non-residential use. But if we think, but there are these, in fact, there is a market failure with the marginal benefit curve from non-residential use is less than that of the market demand curve, lies below the market demand curve, that the market demand curve overstates the net benefits associated with non-residential uses in this example due to the presence of these negative externalities. So in fact, this analysis points us in the other direction. It says, well, the market allocation may not be optimal, and we may have a deadweight loss arising here. And in fact, maybe the planners who had chosen an initial allocation at Z, maybe they were closer to the mark. So when we have the case of externalities or market failure, then there's this question of what do we do about it? So just because as planners, we have insight into the fact that there may be market failures, that doesn't in itself tell us where the right place is. Okay, so if the optimum's not at M, where is it? And that's a challenge that as planners, we should be willing to take on, and we should use the tools of economic analysis to help us figure that out. So the final point here is to think about price-based interventions as an alternative or as a supplement or complement to quantity-based interventions. And the idea behind a price-based intervention is to say, well, wait a minute. If the real problem with the market equilibrium is that there's market failure, that the price signal being sent by the market demand curve for non-residential use is faulty because, for example, in this case, it's not properly accounting for the social costs associated with negative externalities from non-residential uses, then let's fix that market signal. The problem isn't, necessarily with market processes other than the fact that there's this faulty signal. So if we can fix the signal, then we can allow markets to get back to work. And so one way of doing that is to apply a tax to non-residential uses where the tax, and these are called Pigovian tax after a famous economist from over a century ago, Alfred Pigou. So a Pigovian tax that reflects that negative externality and essentially corrects the price signal and in effect internalizes into market signals the externality, what was previously an externality. And so the way to get rid of an externality is to internality it, right? So that's bringing us back. You add this tax, it's going to shift the market demand curve down because now the benefit to market participants of non-residential uses is what it was previously, less the amount of the tax. And so lo and behold, now the new market demand curve will coincide with the true marginal benefit curve, and market processes will in fact now lead us back to the allocation Z. So the new market equilibrium will be at Z. Now, think about the information requirements needed for finding the right tax compared to finding the right allocation Z. I think a little bit of reflection will show you to figure out where Z is, you need not only to know this gap, you need to be able to solve for this point, the point of intersection on your own. So the information requirements for proper quantity-based information intervention exceeds the information burden on planners for price-based intervention. So I would argue that there's strong reason to supplement our toolkit as planners by thinking more actively and effectively intervening in markets where there's reason to believe that markets left to their own devices are going to bring us to the wrong allocation due to some market failure. If we can get an understanding of what those underlying market failures are, then we can look to address those directly. So that brings us then to a conclusion of this presentation, and just to remind you of what some of the key takeaways are. When demand and marginal benefit curves coincide, market equilibrium maximizes total net benefits, and that's a wonderful thing. So we love it when markets don't fail, because then they'll do a lot of the work for us that would be very difficult for us to solve on our own. However, often demand and marginal benefit curves may not coincide, and then the market equilibrium and the optimum diverge. And when that happens, price-based interventions can be an effective alternative to quantity-based interventions such as zoning allocation. So this isn't an argument to eliminate zoning altogether, because even, for example, if we used price-based interventions to tell us how much of residential or non-residential use might be warranted. There's still this question of where those uses should be. Another thing to consider in all of this is kind of part of the takeaway is that markets adjust to current conditions. So as cities evolve, as more people move in, as underlying conditions, economic conditions change, markets can adjust. And so markets, in a sense, are more flexible. Although zoning allocations can also be adjusted, but it's a different kind of, it's a process that doesn't happen as automatically, and it may be more static. Some might argue more stable. And these takeaways, by the way, that we've generated here through our analysis of the economics of land use markets are more broadly applicable than just this particular example. And so as we move on to other sections of the book, other application areas, we'll see these same fundamental principles recurring again and again. And that's good news. It means that if we learn the fundamentals well, then it really gives us a broad range of policy domains affecting urban planning where these ideas are applicable, and thus we can empower ourselves as planners by really making these tools of economic analysis part of our toolkit. So see you on the next one.